Africa's security situation in 2025 remained fragile, from Sudan's catastrophic civil war and the intractable conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo to the insurgencies across the Sahel and Nigeria. The continent faced an unprecedented convergence of humanitarian need and state fragility. We continue our special year-end series by examining the conflicts and crises that defined the year. In this episode, we explore the factors that underpinned Africa's conflicts and the elusive search for peace. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. And joining me now to unpack the peace and security situation in Africa over the last year are, from Lagos, David Otto-Endley, Director of the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. In Nairobi, we have Dr. Hassan Kanenje, who is the Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. And in Dakar, we have Oluwole Ojewale, the Regional Coordinator for the Central Africa region at the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Now, let me begin with you, David. How would you characterize the overall peace and security landscape in Africa in 2025? Has it improved or deteriorated compared to previous years?
I think, unfortunately, it has deteriorated, and this is quite disheartening, for Africa as a continent. And how do we know that? I mean, of course, we have reliable data, especially if you want to consider the previous key indicators that have been published by the Institute for Economy and Peace, which comes up with the Global Peace Index. These key indicators, demonstrate that Africa is one of the worst of continents, when it comes to peace and security, especially when you look at the level of societal safety and security. If you look at the extent of ongoing conflicts within the continent and the degree of militarization within the continent, is very disappointing. Out of the 163 countries that were measured sometime last year, which is not different from what is ongoing this year in 2025, you find that most African countries, especially the likes of DRC, Congo, the likes of Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Somalia, do rank as very low in terms of peace and stability. And this is a picture that cuts across the continent. And the rising coups, that's another indicator, a drop in the success of resolving African conflicts. The likes of Sudan, what is going on between the Rapid Intervention Forces and the Sudanese army, tells you that the continent is drifting towards deteriorating in terms of peace and stability. So all this paints a very grim picture in terms of the level of insecurity within the continent for this year 2025, and likely to continue in 2026.
Now, Dr. Kanenje, coming to you, David has painted us a very clear picture of where the continent is as of this year, 2025. And in the midst of all of these conflicts and crises, the allegations of external players in African conflicts have become persistent from various quarters. Fingers point at external actors in Sudan and the DRC. So the question is, why are African conflicts increasingly becoming proxy wars?
Yeah, indeed. David has painted for us a fairly bleak picture of what is happening, across the continent, from the Sahel to the Cape of Good Hope. And the question about externalization or internationalization of African conflicts, of course, speaks to the emerging relevance of African resources to global economic and technological growth. And so what that has done is not only has it fueled a proliferation of conflict, it has actually made them intractable and impervious to regional and continental mechanisms of conflict resolution. And so I think where the continent is right now, it needs to figure out how best can it build its agency in response to increased external interference and external involvement in its conflict that has actually militated against the continent's plan and program to silence the guns in a few years.
Okay, so Oluwale, let me come to you, because having listened to Dr. Kanenje, there is an economic argument here, the war economy in the Sahel and the DRC. So we're talking about gold, cobalt, trafficking. It became deeply entrenched this year. Is it time to admit that these wars continue because too many powerful people, both local and foreign, are making too much money for peace to be profitable?
Thank you so much for having me. Obviously, that is part of the explanatory variable. Everywhere there is war, there is an issue of economy, there is an issue of livelihood, and there are conflict entrepreneurs, both external and local actors, who essentially profit from such development. But I think it's also a function of two things. One, the complicity of the elite in those places, who will prioritize their own benefits above the broader benefit of the general community. Because in real sense of it, it's largely difficult for external actors to take delivery of those resources if they do not have their local connivance on the part of the local elite in those places. So for instance, in places like Sahel, where the military has taken over power in the past few years, one of the key factors that also sustain them and help them to perpetuate their regime protection is the fact that they have access to those resources like gold, other minerals that are available in those places. The second factor is the fact that another scramble for Africa is going on, and it's a bit different from what we had in the past, in which those imperialists just came to dominate the environment. This time around, we have a set of leaders who are not Pan-African in their thinking and are grossly interested in the things that actually come to fatten their home pockets. So that is why, in the real sense of it, what we see now is large-scale transactional engagement. And we are also seeing what we've never seen in some years back, in which for the first time, we see the rebel governance taking place in Eastern DRC now, in Bukavu and in Goma, in which M23 has actually taken over the reign of governance in those places. And at the heart of it all is also Cortan in those places. So while I admit, and I believe most analysts and scholars will admit that at the heart of these is resources, I think that is taking place because the local elite actually allows that in terms of their transactional arrangement with the external actors.
Right. So, David, still talking proxy wars and foreign military interventions in Africa, whose poster child is perhaps Black Hawk Down, the 1993 defeat of U.S. forces by Somali militias in the battle for Mogadishu. Why are Africans increasingly averse to the idea of foreign boots on their soil, as we see in the Sahel?
The thing is, it's all about solutions, and when you refer to the likes of Black Hole Down in reference to what happened with the U.S. in Somalia, that's another clear indication. That led to what we're experiencing today in the form of Al-Shabaab in many forms. That has destabilized Somalia to the point to which it is unable to deal with its own internal security. And this is the case, as my colleagues have clearly illustrated. It's all about a war economy. What Africans, must understand, which is, what a lot of European countries have already come into terms, is the fact that there is no country that comes to help you as a nation, as a sovereign state, because you're their friend, or they come to help you because you're their enemy. It's all about interest, whether it is in the form of military defense or partnership between one country or the other in the same sense. It's all about ensuring that, as an African nation, you must be able to preserve your territorial integrity. You must be able to, develop a strategy that would enable you to fight against, the level of insecurity within your own state. But it's not just that. It's also with the fact that, the regional bodies, the likes of the African Union, have been unable or perhaps unwilling to deal with other kinds of, level of instability within the continent. And I'm talking about the fact that governments are changing constitutions arbitrarily, they are oppressing the communities and the population when the votes don't go their way. They are changing terms of office, they are changing durations in terms of perhaps age limits. So there is a lot going on within the continent that is acting as a major distraction. For some reason, some of these countries believe that the help has to come from outside. We are not saying that external help is not welcome. What we're saying is that if you don't get your house in order, and we're referring to the African house, the African nations getting their house in order, there is no way that an external party, be it a mercenary from Russia or help from the United States or whatever you want to call it, all this is just preserving the interests of these nations and not the interest of the African nations concerned.
All right. So, Oluwale, in places like Sudan, we aren't just seeing two armies fighting anymore. We are seeing neighborhood-level militias. How does this fragmentation make peace impossible to negotiate? And what is the specific toll on social cohesion?
I think the case of Sudan, it's a very sorry case. Unfortunately, Sudan is happening at a time that global attention is rather fixated on Ukraine or Gaza. And it's unfortunate, like I mentioned, that things have degenerated to where they are now. And one can almost argue successfully that with the proliferation of actors, like you mentioned, in which non-state armed groups like neighborhood militia are now stepping into the vacuum that has been created as a result of this pervasive disorderliness, it goes to show that the center can no longer hold in that country. And beyond looking at the Gulf states that have been mediating and also interacting within that conflict to their own strategic interest, I think it's time that African Union actually steps in, if they have that courage and if they have that modus operandi to be able to step into that murky water now, because things have really degenerated to the point that two illegitimate forces. Don't forget that the Sudanese army is also an illegitimate government in that country, coupled with the RSF and now local militia, have completely fractured order in that country. And I also think the United Nations has not done sufficient enough in terms of, apart from releasing press statement here and there, and then once in a time talk about humanitarian aid into Sudan, which is also disproportionate when you look at the attention that has been given to Gaza, the attention that has been given to war in Ukraine. So it appears to me that what happens in Africa ends in Africa. And every day the report is really, really displeasing and at the same time depressing.
Well, Dr. Kanenje, this year we've seen quite a number of conflicts remain unresolved. For instance, the merger of the EAC and SADC peace processes for the DRC. Now, on paper, it looks like unity, but in reality, M23 rebels still expanded their territory this year. Why did this genuinely local process fail to make progress?
On paper, it appeared as if the SADC and EAC efforts were harmonized. But of course, in practice, this was not the case. And the problem here, it is we focused on treating the symptoms. And the focus has been on proximate causes and issues instead of the underlying factors. So while some of issues to do with disarmament, some issues to do with, for instance, Rwanda, pulling back and something like that, those things were discussed, and a possibility of a political process, the underlying fundamental issues, for instance, the question of ethnic citizenship in DRC, especially in Eastern DRC, the question of the unresolved issues that emerged from 1994 genocide, and the question of the resources of Congo and how Congo needs to be governed, how fractured it has been. These questions have not been addressed. And also the role of actually other external players in fueling the conflict through extractive diplomacy. And it has become apparent that even the big powers, for instance, such as the United States, and it was not about the long-term peace of DRC or the Great Lakes region. It was about, deal making in ways in which, country A can be able to extract certain resources from the DRC. And so because of that, and the absence of a strategy to address these underlying factors, what happened is abandoned in a solution. And immediately afterwards, of course, we saw that not only did M23 not just retain what they had, they actually expanded. And they are pretty, powerful force within the DRC. The solution within the DRC has to be found within the DRC and within the neighbors and within the continent, with the support, of course, of external partners as well as external players. But outside that kind of framework, I think whatever is being done, really it is a wishful thinking, and it's something that probably may just, plant seeds for more conflict, not just within the DRC, but in the wider region of the Great Lakes region.
All right, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will continue our discussion on Africa's peace and security in 2025. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are David Otto Endley, Oluwole Ojewale, and Dr. Hassan Kanenje. Let's now continue our discussion on Africa's peace and security in 2025 and look ahead to how it may impact the year to come. Now, I'll begin with you, Oluwole, by bringing both Kinshasa and Kigali, including the M23, to the negotiating table. Washington and Doha succeeded where the Luanda and Nairobi processes fell short. Is this about leverage? How important is leverage as an asset in peace diplomacy?
No, they didn't succeed. They just paper over the issue. And like Dr. Carnegie mentioned, it's about transactional peace negotiation. So for them, it's about ticking the boxes. And don't forget that there was a conversation around Nobel Peace Prize then, which it's all about how many peace you can quickly resolve, as though there are issues that just emanated today. The fact that M23 is now providing alternative governance in Goma and Bukavu now goes to show that it is not yet Uhuru, as they say in East Africa. I'm reliably informed that Tshisekedi is preparing and gearing up for next year in terms of armament and in terms of trying to find a possibility of striking back in those locations. So I think the issue has not really gone. And it also shows that on the part of the warring parties, it appears there is really no concerted effort to stay committed to solution. I think what we've seen from the Nairobi process to Luanda process to the intervention from SADC and EAC going to the to US in Washington and back in Qatar actually goes to show that the parties are not really on the same page in terms of finding lasting solutions to the crises in those places. Because in places where conflict have been resolved over the years, this kind of meandering is never the path to peace, really. I think what I can deduce from what is happening so far is that the actors, the belligerent in this particular case, and their peace negotiators are only trying to clap with one hand, which is not going to work.
Right. David, the US-Saudi-led peace process in Sudan either stalled or just failed. However, in his recent visit to Washington, the Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud petitioned the US President Donald Trump to help stop the war in Sudan. How would the US stepping in change the course of the Sudan conflict?
Well, I think it hasn't, done much, from the point of view of those ordinary Sudanese who are being killed every day, with the humanitarian, dimension deteriorating. The level of internally displaced persons has increased. The people, refugees, all over the place. There are no concerted efforts to address the crisis in Sudan. And that has been made worse with the fact that some of those who are engaging in quotation in bringing peace, on one hand, are calling for peace. On the other hand, they are actually helping either the Sudanese armed forces or the rapid support forces in continuing to sustain the ongoing conflict. And the reason being that perhaps one thing that has not been understood by the Sudanese, perhaps by the general the international community, and I'm not talking about those who have involved themselves in the peace process, is that there is always an interest at the end of this, and we must not lose sight of that. Without actually having some kind of an internal understanding between these two factions in terms of what is the way forward, then nothing is going to happen. Whether you bring in the US, you bring in the Saudis or the UAE or the Egyptians, each and every one of these parties has a strategic outcome which perhaps might be different from the other. And again, this is one of the reasons why you don't have a concerted effort, you don't have an approach that can actually resolve the crisis.
Dr. Kanenje, let's look at the humanitarian effects or issues occasioned by this crisis. We saw aid fatigue hit hard this year. Western donors are pulling back. Funding for refugees in Africa is currently insufficient. In fact, the UN agencies like the UNHCR and the World Food Programme have repeatedly highlighted massive funding shortfalls. And if you had to look at a refugee mother in the eye, Dr. Kanenje, one who just had her food ration cut by 50% this month, and explain why the world has no money for her, but plenty of money for the drones flying over her head, what would you say?
It's been a disaster. And the United Nations rightly pointed out and described, for instance, the refugee situation in Sudan as the worst humanitarian catastrophe today in our world. And I think to the extent that there is increased fatigue when it comes to actually supporting humanitarian causes, of course, it's shameful. And it's supposed to, it should shame the entire human conscience. Now, but a few things that I think are important, for us, to highlight here. This reduction in funding and the donor fatigue when it comes to that, not only is it creating and exacerbating the already existing humanitarian situations, but it's actually threatening to spread as a result of the spillover effect of refugees who, of course, tend to spread across the countries and start immigrating to countries including the West, where, of course, this fatigue is most prominent when it comes to funding causes in Africa. Now, one of the things that must be done, first of all, especially within the African context, is the continent, first of all, to come together and try to take a local initiative by putting together some resources. Now, part of the challenge to the philosophy of African solutions to African problems is that it's being done without African money. I think in the absence of that, the over-reliance, especially on the traditional partners in the West, like the United States or Europe, when you're having an increasingly inward-looking population and politics, is going to be increasingly difficult to make it sustainable. The United Nations itself is facing funding shortfalls across the board. And that is part of the reason they're actually relocating some of the agencies to Africa, especially in a place like Kenya. And so in recognition of that, the continent and continental bodies and nations should actually come together with a mechanism, first of all, to build some war chest when it comes to humanitarian funding and invite other players outside even the traditional ones to respond to that.
Oluwale, the UN Resolution 2719 provides a basis for UN-assessed contributions to AU-led peace operations. What are the key obstacles to operationalize this funding mechanism, and could it offer more sustainable African-led solutions?
Yes, we are living at a very critical time that the rule-based system that also sustain those UN resolutions broadly is going through serious fracturing now, particularly with the pulling out and decoupling of the United Nations from some of these critical frameworks that is supposed to help in a time like this. And it is quite unfortunate that the situation is now also happening in the context in which, African issues have always been relegated to the back burner. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, even in major media reports today, what you see, what you read about almost every day are issues pertaining to the Middle East conflict, issues pertaining to Russia war in Ukraine. And then even though some reports recently show that Sudan is about the most consequential humanitarian and disaster that is going on in the world now, it has received very little attention. I'm extremely persuaded that if the AU has the framework, if the regional economic communities have the framework, if you have a leader that can stand up like Desmond Tutu, if you have a leader that can rise to the occasion like Nelson Mandela, and a few African leaders that we've had in the recent time, we can actually leverage private sector support, looking at the list of billionaires in the African continent. Looking at whether it is in Kenya, whether it is in Nigeria, whether it is in South Africa, if we've been able to preempt that a time like this is going to come, in which we need to mobilize African resources to address the most pressing concern, whether it is in education, in health, or humanitarian intervention. I believe at this critical point, that is the authentic solution that can be leveraged at a time like this. In fact, the greater challenge, which I think you have also alluded to and the speakers have alluded to here this hour, is the fact that so much is now being spent in terms of trillions of dollars in armaments, which should definitely lead in the direction of further destruction of humanity, while less and less is being planned or put together to save humanity in corridors that truly matters now, where conflict, destitution, displacement have been the order of the day. And I think Sudan perfectly fits that framing now.
My final question to all of you, and I request you to be brief as we wrap up, is if you could implement one concrete policy change in 2026 to ensure an African-led initiative, both at the continental and regional level, actually succeeds, what would it be? David, let's begin with you.
It would be accountability and good governance, and this should be something that should be supervised, and implemented in the backdrop of the responsibility of the African Union. Without accountability, without good governance, we will have a continent where the level of insecurity will continue to deteriorate, and the population of Africa will continue to suffer.
Dr. Kanenje?
I think the continent, especially continental bodies, should remove ambiguities and complexities that make it harder to reach decision-making when action and urgent action is required, especially in humanitarian conflict situations.
And finally, Oluwole, what are your thoughts?
For me, it would be doing anything that is going to really make Africa to wake up from slumber, African Union to wake up from slumber and address the core humanitarian issues from security to displacement that are presently affecting our people at this particular time. I think African Union is extremely lethargic to the issues that we have been raising in the course of this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for those insights. And that's all for this edition of Talk Africa. Once again, a very big thank you to our guests, David Otto Endley, Director of the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, Oluwole Ojowale, Regional Coordinator for the Central Africa region at the Institute for Security Studies, and Dr. Hassan Kanenje, the Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's goodbye.